At the holiday feast, my stepmom toasted, "To the kids who actually belong here," pointing me to a side table. I smiled through it, then froze the grocery accounts I'd been maintaining. Dessert was served cold, along with their first decline transaction. I, 32M, sat at what my stepmom called the overflow table, wedged between a coat rack and the kitchen door, watching my half-siblings laugh at the main dining table like they were filming a holiday commercial. The table I'd eaten at for the first 12 years of my life, before Dad remarried and everything got reshuffled to accommodate his new family's comfort. The thing about being the oldest kid from the first marriage is that you become a ghost in your own childhood home. Not gone, just translucent enough that people can see through you to what they actually want to look at. My stepmother had perfected this art over the past 20 years, and tonight she was giving a masterclass. She stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised, her face glowing in that way people's faces glow when they've had just enough alcohol to say what they've been thinking all along. Dad sat beside her, oblivious as always, probably already planning his escape to the garage where he kept his vintage car magazines and his ability to avoid confrontation. The toast started normally enough. Gratitude for family, for health, for another year together. Then she pivoted, her eyes sweeping past me like I was part of the wallpaper, and raised her glass higher. "To the kids who actually belong here," she said, gesturing to my 3 half-siblings, who shifted uncomfortably but didn't protest. "To the family that chose to stay together." I smiled. I'd learned that smile years ago, the one that costs nothing and prevents everything. My half-sister caught my eye and quickly looked away. She was 19 and still figuring out how complicity worked. Give her time. Nobody said anything. The moment passed like a stone dropping into deep water, barely a ripple. They went back to their prime rib and roasted vegetables, and I went back to being furniture. But something had shifted in me. Some final thread that had been holding my patience together just snapped clean through. See, what my stepmother didn't know, what none of them knew because they'd never bothered to ask, was that I'd been the one keeping their lifestyle afloat for the past 3 years. Dad's business had gone under during the pandemic. He'd owned a small printing company that couldn't compete when everything went digital, and he'd been too proud to adapt. They'd burned through their savings in 18 months, then started burning through credit. By the time I noticed, they were 3 months behind on the mortgage and eating through a rotation of balance transfer cards like they were at an all-you-can-eat buffet. I found out by accident. Dad had called me one night, drunk and crying, talking about losing the house. The house where Mom had lived, where her garden still grew in the backyard, where my childhood existed in the scratches on the hardwood floor and the mark on the wall, where I'd measured my height every birthday until I turned 12 and Mom died and everything stopped. I couldn't let them lose it. Not because they deserved to keep it, but because Mom deserved better than having her memory foreclosed on. So I'd stepped in, quietly. I worked in finance, made good money, had no wife or kids to spend it on. I'd set up accounts in Dad's name, funded them monthly, and given him access to cards that pulled from my credit lines. The mortgage got paid. The utilities stayed on. The grocery bills that fed my stepmother's elaborate dinner parties got covered. I told Dad it was a loan, that we'd work out repayment when he got back on his feet. But we both knew the truth. It was charity, dressed up to preserve his dignity. And like all charity, it came with the unspoken understanding that he'd at least pretend to be grateful. But gratitude has a short shelf life in houses like this one. I finished my plate at the overflow table, complimented the meal to no response, and excused myself to the bathroom. Nobody noticed. I locked the door, pulled out my phone, and opened my banking app. The accounts were easy to access. I'd set them up, after all. Joint access, with me as the primary. I started with the grocery account, the one linked to the card my stepmother used for her weekly Whole Foods runs and her monthly Costco hauls. Frozen. Then the gas account, because why not? Then the household account they used for everything from toilet paper to their streaming services. I left the mortgage account active. Mom's house would stay protected. But everything else, all the comfort and convenience they'd grown accustomed to while treating me like a stray they'd forgotten to chase off the porch, that was done. I flushed the toilet for authenticity, washed my hands, and went back out to find dessert being served. My stepmother had made her famous tiramisu, the one she'd learned to make from a cooking class she'd charged to one of my cards. I watched her cut generous slices for everyone at the main table, then glance at me like she'd forgotten I existed. She brought me a small slice, The kind you give to someone you're obligated to feed but would rather not. I thanked her with that same smile, the one that cost nothing, and took a bite. It was delicious. Everything she made was delicious. She had all the time in the world to perfect her recipes when someone else was paying the bills. I left right after dessert, citing an early morning at work. Dad walked me to the door, half-heartedly suggesting I stay longer, but his heart wasn't in it, and neither was mine. I hugged him because I still loved him somewhere under the disappointment and resentment. And then I drove home to my quiet apartment where nobody toasted to people who actually belonged and nobody relegated anyone to overflow tables. The first text came 3 days later. Dad, asking if there was an issue with the grocery card because it had been declined at the store. I responded that I'd look into it, then didn't. The second text came 6 hours after that, more urgent now, because the gas card had also been declined and my stepmother was stranded at a pump across town. I told him I'd been meaning to talk to him about the accounts, that I was restructuring some things financially and would need to make some changes. Could we meet for coffee? We met at the diner near his house, the one where he used to take me for pancakes on Saturday mornings before Mom got sick. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. The business failure had aged him, or maybe it was the weight of living in a house where he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He asked me what was going on with the cards, and I told him the truth. That I'd been thinking about the holiday dinner, about where I'd been seated, about what had been said. He started to interrupt, to make excuses, but I held up my hand. I reminded him that I'd been covering their expenses for 3 years, that I'd saved the house, paid for the groceries, kept the lights on, that I'd done it out of love for him and respect for Mom's memory, not because I owed them anything, and that in return, I'd been treated like an outsider at my own family's table. His face did something complicated. Shame and anger and defensiveness, all fighting for control. He said I was being oversensitive, that his wife hadn't meant anything by the toast, that I was reading too much into his seating arrangement. I asked him if he'd corrected her, if he'd said anything at all. The silence answered for him. I told him the accounts would stay frozen except for the mortgage, that one would continue because I'd promised myself Mom's house wouldn't be lost, and I kept my promises even when nobody else did. But everything else, they were on their own. He asked how they were supposed to manage. I suggested he figure it out the way most adults did, with jobs and budgets and the kind of financial planning that didn't depend on a son they barely acknowledged. Then I paid for his coffee and left. Update 1. The calls started within a week. First from Dad, asking me to reconsider, to think about the kids, to remember that family was supposed to support each other. I reminded him that support went both ways and asked when he planned to start depositing his share. Then my stepmother called, which surprised me because we hadn't spoken directly in years. Everything between us had been filtered through Dad or communicated through pointed silences. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way people sound when they're furious but trying not to show it. She told me I was being cruel, that I was punishing innocent children for something she might have said thoughtlessly. I asked her which part had been thoughtless, the toast itself or the seating arrangement that had preceded it. She said I was twisting things, making drama where none existed. I told her that was interesting coming from someone who'd just called me after years of pretending I was invisible unless she needed something. She hung up. Dad called back an hour later, angrier now, asking what I'd said to upset his wife. I told him I'd answered her questions honestly, and if honesty was upsetting then maybe the problem wasn't the answers. My half-sibling stayed quiet through all of this, which I expected. They were in their teens and early 20s, still living at home or close enough that they depended on parental support. They couldn't afford to take sides, and I didn't blame them. I remembered what it was like to be young and powerless in that house. But my youngest half-brother surprised me. He was 17, quiet, the kind of kid who noticed everything and said nothing. He sent me a text message 2 weeks after the dinner, apologizing for what had happened, saying it wasn't right how I'd been treated. I thanked him and told him he didn't need to apologize for other people's choices. He said he knew, but he wanted me to know that not everyone at that table had been comfortable with how things went down. It was a small thing, that text, but it mattered more than he probably knew. Update 2. A month passed. I heard through family friends that Dad had taken a job at a local hardware store, something to bring in steady income. My stepmother had started selling her baked goods at a farmer's market, trying to monetize the cooking skills she'd perfected on my dime. They'd cut their expenses, dropped some streaming services, started shopping at regular grocery stores instead of Whole Foods. Part of me felt guilty. The part that had been raised to prioritize family above everything. To sacrifice without expecting recognition. To be grateful for whatever scraps of belonging were offered. But that part was getting smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. The other part, the part that had sat at the overflow table and smiled through being erased from my own family, that part felt something different. Not quite satisfaction, but maybe vindication. The proof that they could survive without me, that they'd just chosen not to because it was easier to take than to adjust. Dad called one evening and asked if we could talk. Really talk, he said, not just argue about money. I agreed to meet him at Mom's grave, neutral ground where neither of us could storm out easily. He looked different, standing there with his hands in his pockets, staring at the headstone like it might offer him answers. He told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that maybe he'd let things slide for too long, let his new family's comfort come at my expense. He didn't apologize outright, couldn't quite get the words out, but he circled around it enough that I understood what he was trying to say. I asked him if he remembered the last real conversation we'd had before Mom died. He shook his head. I did, though. She'd made him promise to take care of me, to make sure I never felt alone or forgotten. He'd held her hand and sworn he would. He started crying then, quiet tears that he wiped away quickly, embarrassed. He said he'd broken that promise, let it slip away year by year until he'd forgotten it entirely. I told him I knew, that I'd known for a long time. We stood there for a while, not talking, just existing in the space where our family used to be before it splintered and reformed into something unrecognizable. Finally, he asked what it would take to fix things between us. I told him I didn't know if things could be fixed, but maybe they could be rebuilt differently. Without the resentment, without the obligation, without the pretense that we were something we weren't. Update 3. 6 months later, things hadn't magically healed, because that's not how real life works. But they'd shifted into something more honest. Dad and I met for lunch once a month, just the two of us, and talked about surface things mostly, but sometimes deeper. He was trying, in his awkward, inadequate way, and I was learning to accept effort instead of waiting for perfection. I still paid the mortgage on Mom's house. That hadn't changed and wouldn't. But Dad had taken over everything else, working 2 jobs to make it happen, and I respected that. My stepmother and I existed in a state of cold neutrality, speaking when necessary, ignoring each other when possible. I'd never get an apology from her, and I'd stopped expecting one. My half-siblings were finding their own way. The youngest still texted me occasionally, updating me on his college applications and asking for advice. The middle one had gotten engaged and awkwardly invited me to the wedding, making it clear I wouldn't be expected at the main family table, but would be welcome at the ceremony. I appreciated the honesty, even if the situation was depressing. The oldest, my half-sister who'd looked away during the toast, reached out 6 months after the dinner. She apologized, not for what had been said, but for saying nothing. She told me she'd moved out, gotten her own apartment, started creating distance from the toxic patterns she'd grown up thinking were normal. We got coffee, talked carefully around the bigger issues, and made plans to do it again. Maybe we'd never be close, but we didn't have to be enemies either. The real revelation came when I stopped expecting my father's house to feel like home. It wasn't home anymore, maybe hadn't been since Mom died and her presence stopped holding everything together. Home was my apartment, my space, the life I'd built independently. The house was just a building I had history with, and history didn't obligate me to keep hurting myself trying to fit into spaces where I was unwanted. I still dreamed sometimes about that overflow table, about the toast, about sitting there smiling while being erased. But in my dreams now, I stood up and walked out, and that felt more honest than the smile ever had. Reality had been messier, slower, more complicated, but the ending was the same. I'd left, in all the ways that mattered, and I wasn't going back. The last time I drove past the house, I noticed my stepmother had finally let Mom's garden die. The roses Mom had planted the year I was born, the ones I'd been paying the water bill to keep alive, were gone. Just bare earth where beauty used to grow. I thought it would hurt more than it did, but mostly I felt relief. The garden had been another chain, another obligation, another reason to stay tethered to people who didn't value what they had. Let it die. Let them live in the house they'd fought so hard to keep without understanding what made it worth keeping in the first place. I drove home to my apartment, ordered takeout, and spent the evening doing absolutely nothing important. And for the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel guilty about any of it. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.